The surgeon who learned that healing starts with forgiveness. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The rain came down in thin silver lines over the glass roof of St. Jude Hospital, each drop echoing the quiet exhaustion inside the intensive care unit. Dr. Ethan Vale stood motionless by the window, his reflection fragmented by the raindrops. Once celebrated as one of the youngest cardiac surgeons to receive national recognition, he was now suspended, his career on hold after a controversial operation had gone wrong. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled slightly when he thought of the patient he could not save. Rumors had spread through the city like wildfire, the surgeon without a heart. Ethan had stopped fighting them. He had learned that sometimes silence hurt less than defense. That morning, as the hospital lights flickered against the storm, a woman stepped into his life again. Grace Nguyen, the head nurse in pediatrics, her hair pulled back neatly, eyes carrying a calm he both feared and longed for. Years ago, she had been his fiancée before tragedy broke them apart. Now she was standing in front of him with a file in her hands and a plea in her eyes. "Ethan," she said softly, "I need your help. Not as a doctor but as a husband." The words stunned him. He blinked, unsure if he heard correctly. Grace took a breath, her voice trembling but determined. "My sister passed away last month. Her little girl, Lila, has a severe heart condition. The hospital will not release her into my care unless there is a stable family listed. I cannot lose her too, Ethan. The only way is for you to sign as my spouse for just 3 months until I can finalize guardianship." Ethan's chest tightened. A fake marriage. It sounded absurd, desperate, and yet the desperation in Grace's eyes was real. He remembered her sister's laugh, remembered the way Grace used to talk about Lila when she was just a baby. "You are asking me to lie to the system," he said quietly. Grace nodded. "Yes. But it is the only truth that can save her." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The thunder rolled outside, shaking the windows. Ethan looked down at the file in her hands, the child's photo clipped to the corner, a small girl with dark hair and a heart monitor taped across her chest. His throat tightened. She was so fragile, like every patient he had sworn to protect. Grace whispered, "I will understand if you say no." Ethan's voice was low, almost a whisper. "No, you will not. Because you know I cannot watch someone die when I can still do something." He took the pen from her hand and signed. The ink bled slightly under the rain that seeped in through the cracked window frame. 3 months, he said, without looking up. Grace nodded, her eyes glistening with relief. 3 months. No one needs to know. But as they left the hospital together, walking under a single umbrella through the storm, Ethan knew that every contract begins with rules and ends with consequences. He told himself it was just a paper, just an act. But deep inside, something stirred, a quiet pulse he thought he had lost long ago. The pulse of a heart learning how to forgive. The following week, the hospital buzzed with the usual rhythm of beeping monitors and hurried footsteps, but for Dr. Ethan Vale, everything felt quieter. He had signed the papers. He was now, on paper, Grace Nguyen's husband. The absurdity of it struck him each time he saw his name beside hers on the guardianship forms pinned to the hospital's file board. Yet, every time he passed the pediatric ward and saw little Lila sleeping with oxygen tubes resting gently on her cheeks, something in his chest eased. She reminded him of why he had said yes. Grace tried to keep their arrangement professional. She always addressed him formally, Dr. Vale, as if distance could make the lie cleaner. But in the small apartment she rented near the hospital, formality had no space. The night he moved in, rain still glistened on his coat. The place smelled faintly of jasmine and antiseptic. A single lamp flickered near the sofa where he would sleep. Grace showed him the drawer she had cleared for him and the paperwork that detailed their rules. Rule 1: No emotional involvement. Rule 2: They would attend all hospital interviews and custody meetings together. Rule 3: After 3 months, they would file for annulment, quietly, without explanation. Ethan read each line silently before signing again. "It is only for her," he said. Grace nodded, her eyes on the floor. "For Lila, always." The first days were mechanical. They cooked in silence, shared the same table without conversation. Grace left early for her morning rounds while Ethan stayed behind to prepare notes for his appeal to the medical board. The sound of the kettle, the shuffle of papers, and the small coughs from Lila's room became their routine. One evening, when Lila had a fever, Grace panicked and spilled her coffee as she searched for medication. Ethan reached her side, steady and calm, the same steadiness he once had in the operating room. "She will be fine," he said gently, cooling the child's forehead with a damp cloth. For the first time, Grace looked at him not as the man who had broken her heart but as the doctor who had never stopped caring. That night, after Lila finally slept, Grace whispered, "I did not think you would still remember how to comfort someone." Ethan smiled faintly. "It is muscle memory, I guess. The heart remembers before the mind does." His words hung in the air longer than either expected. Days turned into weeks. They attended the family court hearing together, presenting themselves as a couple determined to provide stability. The judge glanced at their simple wedding bands and nodded. "Lila is lucky to have you both," she said. As they walked out of the courthouse, the autumn sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Grace exhaled, her shoulders finally relaxing. "It worked," she said softly. "We did it." Ethan glanced at her and replied, "We started it." "That is different." That night, at the apartment, Grace found him sitting on the couch, reading an old medical journal. The lamplight softened his face. "You still study?" she asked quietly. "Every surgeon prepares for a second chance," he said, closing the book. Grace hesitated at the doorway. "Maybe that is what this is too." He looked up, puzzled. "What is?" She smiled sadly. "A second chance. For both of us." He did not answer, but the look in his eyes said enough. Somewhere between the quiet meals and the shared caretaking, the boundaries of their agreement began to blur. He still told himself it was temporary, that it was only duty, but when Lila ran into his arms the next morning, calling him Dad for the first time, Ethan felt something shift deep inside him. It was not just a contract anymore. It was the fragile beginning of something real. By the second month, the boundaries between duty and affection had grown dangerously thin. Grace began to notice how Ethan always woke before dawn, brewing coffee in silence, leaving a cup for her on the counter without saying a word. The simple gesture spoke more than apologies ever could. At the hospital, whispers followed them everywhere. Dr. Vale and Nurse Nguyen, the perfect couple, someone joked in the cafeteria. Grace forced a polite smile, but Ethan's eyes flickered with discomfort. Pretending was easy on paper, harder in public. That afternoon, while reviewing Lila's new test results, Ethan found her heartbeat stronger, her numbers stable. "She is responding to the new treatment," he told Grace with quiet relief. Grace's lips trembled into a smile. "Then maybe this time we will make it." But that hope came with a warning from Dr. Harris, the hospital administrator. "You are still under review, Ethan. One wrong step and your suspension becomes permanent. Keep your personal affairs separate." Ethan nodded, though his jaw tightened. As they left the meeting, Grace could sense the old pride in him, the same pride that once kept him from asking for help. That night, she sat by the window, the city lights flickering beyond the rain-slick glass. "You still think this is all about redemption, do you?" she asked softly. Ethan turned from his desk. "It is about doing what is right. For her. And for you?" she pressed. He looked down, his voice low. "For me, forgiveness feels harder than any surgery I have ever performed." Silence filled the small apartment, heavy yet strangely peaceful. A week later, Grace brought him to the charity committee meeting at the hospital. The foundation was hosting a winter gala to raise funds for pediatric care, and the board insisted that she and her husband attend. They want to see stability, Grace explained. Couples who can inspire donors. Ethan straightened his tie with visible discomfort. So now I am an accessory for good publicity? Grace smirked lightly. Think of it as post-op therapy. You are learning to smile again. The night of the gala glimmered with chandeliers and laughter, polished shoes and champagne. Grace wore a simple navy dress, elegant yet modest, while Ethan looked every inch the surgeon he used to be: calm, composed, unknowingly magnetic. As they entered, flashes from cameras followed them. Grace whispered, "Just keep your arm around me. We will be fine." But halfway through the evening, a journalist approached, microphone in hand. "Dr. Vale, it is good to see you again. After last year's tragedy, how does it feel to be back in the spotlight?" The room fell silent. Ethan froze, the memories hitting like a wave: the failed operation, the patient he lost, the guilt he carried every day. Grace stepped forward, squeezing his hand. "What happened last year was a tragedy, yes," she said clearly, her voice steady. "But it does not erase the hundreds of lives he saved. Ethan Vale is a man who still believes in healing, even when the world stops believing in him." Her words cut through the murmurs. The reporter hesitated, lowered the mic, and walked away. For a brief second, the entire room seemed to exhale. Ethan turned to her, eyes glistening under the soft lights. "You did not have to do that." Grace replied simply, "Yes, I did." Later that night, after the gala, they drove home in silence. The city passed by in streaks of gold and blue. Grace leaned her head against the window. "You did well tonight," she said quietly. "You looked like the man I used to love." Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but his voice was soft. "And you looked like the woman I never stopped loving." She turned, surprised, but he only smiled faintly and looked ahead at the road. Somewhere between the quiet hum of the tires and the echo of her heartbeat, she realized the contract had already changed. It was no longer about survival. It was about two broken souls learning how to breathe again. In the weeks that followed the gala, the rhythm of their lives changed. The public saw them as a perfect couple, a picture of redemption and grace, but inside the small apartment, everything felt more fragile, more real. Ethan began to cook breakfast for Lila before Grace woke up, tying her hair into clumsy braids while she giggled and called him Dad again and again. The sound filled the house like sunlight through the window blinds. Grace watched them quietly, her heart caught between gratitude and fear. She had promised herself that this arrangement would stay temporary, yet every day it became harder to imagine letting it go. One evening, after putting Lila to bed, Grace found Ethan sitting on the couch surrounded by folders and legal documents. "What are you working on?" she asked. "A petition," he said. "If I can prove my reinstatement to the medical board, I might return to surgery. But I need a character witness." Grace crossed her arms, teasing gently, "You mean me?" He smiled faintly. "You are the only one who knows both the surgeon and the man." She hesitated, then sat beside him. "Then maybe it is time the world sees the man too." Their shoulders brushed. The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. Outside, the winter rain tapped against the window, steady and soft. Grace looked at him and whispered, "Do you ever think about what we lost?" Ethan's voice was low. "Every day. But lately, I think more about what we are finding again." That was the moment she realized how dangerous closeness could be. The next morning, she avoided eye contact, speaking only about Lila's medication schedule. Ethan noticed but said nothing. He understood that the heart, like a wound, healed unevenly. Days later, they attended another review session at the hospital. The board questioned Ethan's judgment, his ethics, his emotional stability. Grace sat beside him, answering calmly, defending his integrity. "Dr. Vale is not reckless," she said firmly. He is human. He made a choice that any surgeon with compassion might have made. After the hearing, Ethan thanked her quietly. You did not have to stand up for me again. Grace smiled faintly. Yes, I did. Because you would have done the same. That night, back home, a small celebration awaited them. Lila had drawn a picture of all three together, her, Grace, and Ethan standing under a big red heart. She handed it proudly to Ethan. This is our family, she said. He stared at the drawing, something warm and painful rising in his chest. It is beautiful, Lila, he whispered. Later, after she went to sleep, he placed the drawing on the refrigerator and turned to Grace. She believes in us more than we do. Grace nodded slowly. Children see what adults are too afraid to admit. The air between them grew still. Ethan took a hesitant step closer. Grace, he said softly, I know this was supposed to be pretend, but I do not want to pretend anymore. She looked at him, eyes wide with tears that refused to fall. Do not make promises we cannot keep, she whispered. I am not promising, he replied. I am choosing. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, quietly, Grace reached out and took his hand. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city lights shimmered like fragments of hope reflected in the puddles. In that fragile silence, something wordless passed between them: trust, forgiveness, and the faint beginning of love reborn. Spring crept quietly into the city, washing away the gray of winter, but inside the hospital, tension began to rise again. Ethan's appeal for reinstatement had reached the final stage, and every decision, every word, mattered. Grace watched him grow restless, the sleepless nights returning, the perfectionism creeping back into his bones. One afternoon, while reviewing case notes, Ethan received a call from Dr. Harris. The board required one more evaluation, a psychological assessment to determine whether he had fully recovered from the trauma of his past. Ethan sighed heavily. They will never see me as anything but broken, he muttered. Grace placed a hand on his arm. Then show them that broken can still heal. He looked at her, wanting to believe, but doubt lingered like a shadow. That weekend, Lila had a minor complication. Her heartbeat fluttered irregularly during the night, and Grace rushed her to the emergency room. Ethan followed immediately, his instincts taking over. Inside the brightly lit ward, he checked her monitors, adjusted her oxygen flow, and spoke to the resident physician with authority and calm precision. The attending nurse whispered, "He still has it." Hours later, when Lila stabilized, Ethan slumped into a chair, his shoulders shaking. Grace knelt beside him. "You saved her," she whispered. Ethan shook his head slowly. "No, Grace. You saved me. You made me remember who I was." The next day, as word spread about his intervention, the hospital board called him in. Dr. Harris's tone was unreadable. "You crossed protocol, Ethan. You are still suspended. But, what you did saved a child's life. And that matters." The board decided to reinstate him under supervision, effective immediately. When Ethan walked out of that meeting, Grace was waiting in the corridor, a faint smile trembling on her lips. "Welcome back, Dr. Vale," she said. He exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and disbelief. "It feels strange to be given a second chance." Grace replied softly, "Maybe it is time you stop seeing it as given and start seeing it as earned." That evening, they returned home to find Lila sitting at the table, coloring a card. She held it up proudly. "For you, Dad. And you, Mom. Because you both fix hearts." Ethan's eyes glistened as he took the card. Grace's hand brushed his, a quiet current sparking between them. But the peace was short-lived. The next morning, a hospital lawyer arrived at their door. "There is an issue," he said, laying a file on the table. "Your marriage license appears irregular. Someone submitted an anonymous complaint suggesting the marriage was fraudulent." Grace froze. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Who would?" "It does not matter," the lawyer interrupted. If this investigation proceeds, your reinstatement could be revoked, and Grace could lose guardianship of Lila. After he left, the apartment felt smaller, the silence sharper. Grace buried her face in her hands. I caused this, she whispered. Ethan knelt before her, lifting her chin gently. No. We both did. But I will not let them destroy what we built. Ethan, if the truth comes out, then I will stand in front of it, he said firmly. You will not lose Lila. Not again. That night, while Lila slept peacefully, Ethan drafted a statement for the board. His reflection in the laptop screen looked calm, resolute. Grace stood behind him, tears in her eyes. You are risking everything, she said. He looked up at her. Then let it be for something that finally means everything. Outside, thunder rumbled again, but this time Ethan did not flinch. He had faced storms before. Now he understood that healing was not about perfection, it was about the courage to stand in the light, even when the truth hurt. And he was ready. The next morning, the sun rose pale and uncertain, casting long stripes of light across the kitchen floor. Ethan had barely slept. His written statement to the hospital board sat neatly in an envelope beside his coffee mug. Grace moved quietly around the room, her face drawn and pale. They both knew what would happen once the board received that letter. It was not just his career on the line now, it was everything they had built together. You do not have to do this, Grace said softly. Ethan looked at her, tired but steady. Yes, I do. The truth does not destroy people, Grace. Hiding does. She wanted to argue, but his calmness silenced her. A few hours later, they arrived at the hospital for the emergency hearing. The boardroom was cold, the air thick with judgment. Ethan handed in the envelope himself. This contains my full admission, he said clearly. Grace Nguyen and I entered a temporary marriage arrangement to ensure the guardianship of her niece. It was wrong, but it was done for the right reason to protect a child. Murmurs filled the room. One of the senior members frowned. You are admitting to falsifying legal documentation, Dr. Vale? Yes, Ethan said. But I am not asking for leniency. I am asking for understanding. Because if the system punishes honesty harder than deceit, then what lesson do we teach the next generation of healers? Grace's eyes filled with tears as she listened. When they left the room, the corridor felt endless. Hours later, a verdict was announced. Ethan would retain his license but be placed under ethical review for 6 months. Grace would keep guardianship of Lila, provided there was transparency moving forward. Relief and exhaustion hit them both at once. Outside the hospital, Grace leaned against the wall, breathing hard. You did it, she whispered. We did it, Ethan corrected gently. But at a cost. That night, back home, silence sat between them like a ghost. Lila was asleep, her small drawing of the three of them taped to the refrigerator door. Grace traced the edges of it with her fingers. Ethan, I think maybe it is time we end the contract, she said finally. His chest tightened. If that is what you want. She looked up at him, her voice trembling. It was supposed to be pretend. But it stopped feeling that way a long time ago. And that scares me. He took a step closer. Grace, what scares you more? That it feels real, or that it might last? She blinked away tears. Both. Ethan reached for her hand, his voice steady. Then let us stop being afraid. She shook her head. No, you need time to rebuild your career. Lila needs stability. I cannot ask you to stay out of guilt. You are not asking, he said quietly, I am choosing. But Grace turned away, whispering, sometimes love means letting go before it hurts worse. The next morning, she packed a small suitcase for Lila and herself. She left a note on the kitchen table. Thank you for saving us. But now you need to save yourself. When Ethan returned from the hospital that evening, the apartment felt hollow. The lamp still flickered, the scent of jasmine still lingered faintly in the air. He sat down at the table, reading her note again and again until the words blurred. For the first time in years, he cried openly, not from loss, but from understanding. Forgiveness, he realized, was not a moment. It was a process. And maybe this was part of it. Somewhere deep down, he knew their story was not finished. It was only paused, waiting for the next heartbeat to begin again. Weeks passed. Spring gave way to the early heat of summer, and the days at St. Jude Hospital blurred into one another. Ethan threw himself into work, volunteering for extra shifts, rebuilding the trust he had lost. The new residents looked up to him, unaware of the scandal that had nearly ended his career. Yet every time he walked past the pediatric wing, his steps slowed. He could still hear Lila's laughter echoing in those hallways. He had not seen her or Grace since they left, but their absence clung to him like a second heartbeat. At night, he would return to the empty apartment, its walls echoing with the ghosts of warm mornings and shared laughter. The refrigerator still held Lila's drawing, slightly wrinkled at the corners, the red heart fading but visible. One evening, as he stood staring at it, a knock came at the door. He hesitated, half expecting his landlord or a courier, but when he opened it, Dr. Harris stood there, holding a file. "I thought you should see this," Harris said, stepping inside. "It is a recommendation letter. The board is closing your review early. They were impressed by your honesty." Ethan took the file, scanning the first line in disbelief. "I am fully reinstated?" Harris nodded. "You earned it. But you look like a man who lost more than a title." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe I needed to lose everything to understand what matters." After Harris left, the apartment felt quieter than ever. Ethan sat at his desk, turning the recommendation letter in his hands, but it felt hollow without someone to share it with. A week later, he received a call from an unfamiliar number. When he answered, Grace's voice came through soft, hesitant. "Ethan, it is Lila. She is back in the hospital. The new medication caused complications. She keeps asking for you." The sound of her voice, fragile, breaking, made his chest tighten. "I am on my way," he said simply, grabbing his coat. When he arrived, Grace was standing outside the ICU, her face pale from exhaustion. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she whispered, "She asked me if you stopped being her dad." Ethan swallowed hard. "No, Grace. I never stopped." Inside, Lila lay pale and weak, her little hands clinging to the stuffed rabbit Ethan had once won for her at the spring fair. He sat beside her, gently taking her hand. "Hey, sunshine," he said softly. Her eyes fluttered open, a faint smile appearing. "Dad," she whispered. "You came." "Always," he said, his voice trembling. Grace watched from the doorway, tears streaming silently down her face. In that sterile white room, surrounded by the sound of machines, something deeper than apology passed between them. For Ethan, it was the reminder that healing was not found in medals or reviews. It was in moments like this, fragile but real, when love dared to return. The next 48 hours felt endless. Lila's condition fluctuated between fragile and hopeful, and Ethan refused to leave her side. He slept in a chair by her bed, monitoring every heartbeat, every flicker of the monitor, his surgeon's instinct guiding him even though he was no longer assigned to her case. Grace brought him coffee, her hands trembling when she passed the cup. "You need rest," she whispered. "Not yet," he replied, his eyes fixed on Lila's small chest rising and falling. Late one night, when the ward had gone quiet and the fluorescent lights dimmed to a soft hum, Lila stirred and whispered faintly, "Dad, are you sad?" Ethan forced a smile. "No, sweetheart. Just thinking." "About Mommy Grace?" she asked, her voice weak but curious. Ethan's throat tightened. "Yes, about both of you." She smiled faintly. "Then do not be sad. Mommy Grace says people who forgive shine brighter." Her words pierced him more deeply than any reprimand ever could. He nodded, unable to speak. Hours later, Lila's condition stabilized. The cardiology team credited Ethan's presence, saying his calm had kept her pulse steady through the night. Grace found him sitting in the waiting area, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "She will make it," she said softly. "Because of you." Ethan shook his head. "Because of us." Grace sat beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You always said healing starts with truth. Maybe forgiveness starts with coming home." He looked at her, unsure if he had the right to believe her again. "Grace, after everything, after the lies, after what we did, how do we come back from that?" She met his gaze. "By choosing each other again. Without conditions. Without papers." The next morning, when Lila was moved out of ICU, Ethan returned to the apartment one last time. The air still smelled faintly of jasmine, and the note Grace had left weeks ago was still on the table. He placed a new envelope beside it. Inside was a signed letter of resignation, his voluntary departure from the hospital board. The letter read, "I have spent my life fixing hearts, but I forgot that the heart I broke the most was my own. I am leaving to start over, not as a surgeon first, but as a man who finally understands what healing truly means." Later that evening, he walked into the hospital garden where Grace and Lila were waiting under the cherry blossoms that had just begun to bloom. Lila ran toward him, arms wide, her laughter bright and pure. Grace stood still, watching as he lifted the little girl into his arms. "I thought you would not come," Grace said softly. Ethan smiled. "I almost did not. But then I realized, if forgiveness is the medicine, this is where I am supposed to take it." Grace stepped closer, tears glimmering in her eyes. "Then take it, Ethan." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver ring he had once given her years ago. "No contracts. No signatures. Just a promise that I will keep choosing you." Grace's breath caught. "And if I say yes? Then we start healing. Together." The wind stirred the petals around them, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt whole. 1 year later, the sun rose gently over the new Cartervale Children's Heart Center, its glass walls reflecting the soft glow of morning. The hospital was smaller than St. Jude, built not for prestige but for purpose. Ethan walked through the lobby, now filled with laughter, color, and hope. On the wall hung a framed plaque that read, "Founded in honor of Lila and Gwyn, proof that healing begins with forgiveness." Grace stood beside him, dressed in a white nurse's coat embroidered with her new title, Director of Pediatric Care. Lila, now stronger and brighter than ever, sat at the reception desk drawing hearts on a piece of paper. She looked up and waved. "Mommy Grace, Daddy Ethan, come look." Ethan crouched beside her, smiling as she showed him her latest drawing, 3 hearts, all connected by a single golden line. "It is us," she said proudly. "One big heart." Grace leaned over and kissed the top of Lila's head. "That is exactly what we are." The ceremony that morning was small and simple. Doctors, nurses, and families gathered to celebrate the center's opening. Dr. Harris gave a short speech, his voice filled with pride. "This center stands not only as a place for medical recovery but as a reminder that compassion and integrity can rebuild lives. And no one embodies that better than Dr. Ethan Vale and Nurse Grace Gwyn." Applause filled the hall. Ethan took the microphone briefly, his voice calm but emotional. "A year ago, I believed that a surgeon's hands could fix anything. But I learned that some wounds require more than skill. They require honesty, humility, and the courage to forgive. This center is for every patient who believes they are beyond healing and for every doctor who has ever forgotten that they are human." His words lingered long after he stepped down. Later that afternoon, as the guests left, Grace and Ethan stood on the hospital's rooftop garden overlooking the city. The wind carried the scent of blooming jasmine, the same fragrance that once filled their small apartment. "It feels different here," Grace said softly. "Like the air itself is lighter." Ethan smiled, his hand brushing hers. "Maybe that is what forgiveness does. It makes room to breathe again." Lila ran up to them, holding 2 paper hearts she had cut out. She handed one to each of them. You have to make a wish before you let it go, she instructed. They smiled, closing their eyes. When they opened them again, they released the paper hearts into the wind, watching them rise higher and higher until they disappeared into the light. Grace looked at Ethan. What did you wish for? He smiled gently. I did not wish. I thanked. For what? She asked. He turned to her, his voice quiet but certain. For the second chance I never thought I would get. As the sun dipped low behind the skyline, they stood together not as doctor and nurse, not as husband and wife by contract, but as a family that had found its way through truth, forgiveness, and love. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan Vale's heart beat not with regret, but with peace.